In the past decade, I think we can all recognize that there's been a rise in global fascism. As liberal capitalism reaches the limits of its internal contradictions, societies have either thrashed out in violent reactionary movements, or just been able to skirt by on sufficient enough reform, at least for now. But as capitalist exploitation makes the gaps between different classes grow wider and wider, whether it's through rampant, historical levels of wealth inequality, or the conservative forces of capital dismantling the social welfare systems that liberals or social democrats have been able to eke out of the system as concessions, reactionary movements have been able to take advantage of this to lobby their interests and propagandize a now fearful and less well-off populace. The very existence of the capital-owning class makes this degradation of liberal capitalism— I say degradation like this isn't inevitable, this isn't a glitch in the system. This is the inevitable endpoint of a system that puts all power in the hands of capital owners. It's just about how far off you can put their efforts to do a complete hostile takeover of society. Just look at Elon Musk. In a matter of years, he went from the guy who wanted to be the cool liberal tech innovator to a now open fascist who does Nazi salutes. He's a perfect example of how capital turns on normalized liberal society the moment they see an opportunity to take advantage of a reactionary wave that'll end up with them acquiring even more power. The man is pretty openly just the shadow president, who has way more power than the establishment liberal institutions ever intended a man like him to be able to get, at least outside of bourgeois democratic means. See, fascism is a reactionary movement. It's the wealthy establishment's last-ditch effort to maintain power in the face of proletarian movements. And that can come in a few ways. In the most famous historical examples, it was a pretty immediate and violent reaction to leftist movements gaining power in their respective countries. But it can also be a kind of delayed reaction. Remember how we said it's about how far off you can put their efforts to do a hostile takeover? Sometimes it takes a while, and sometimes liberal institutions have been successful, at least at putting off the overtly hostile actions of capital. So, say for example the United States, having established weekends, minimum wage, time off, the legalization of unionizing, workers' movements got away with establishing those even in the face of fierce opposition, without the wealthy just doing a full takeover. Or if that was attempted, it was put down or put off. But you can't put it off forever when capitalism is specifically designed to give the wealthy the most power in society. Those concessions we forced out of capital have stayed as grievances even after all these years, in some cases decades, and in some cases over a century. They will always try to poke and prod at those concessions through lobbying or cultivating culture war shit to get the working class to infight, but they'll eventually have built back their power over bourgeois democracy to come back at those rights and attempt to dismantle any worker movements that exist. It's the fatal flaw of liberal democracies, and it's the reason social democracy can't work. The very existence of the capital-owning class is the problem here. These hierarchical class positions incentivize the higher capital class to dominate the working classes below them, no matter what kind of futile guardrails or protections you may try to put into place. So, just to recap those 2 points, sometimes fascism is the immediate violent reaction of the wealthy to leftist movements, and sometimes it's the slow buildup of capital grievances over concessions that they're vying time over to pounce when conditions are right for them to take over. With those 2 methods in mind, we can now look at different instances of fascist movements growing to analyze and contrast how they work. The German and Italian states of the 1920s were socially in shambles. Rampant discontent from the conditions the aftermath of the Great War put them in, along with economic depression, left society fearful and desperate. In the wake of those conditions, socialist or communist movements saw a growing popularity. Rosa Luxemburg and democratic socialists like her were offering real answers for the injustices the empires people were living in put them under, and the exploitation of capital. She was purged by the German government for her efforts. That purge, aided by the way by the SPD or Social Democrats, so that shows where their priorities were. Social Democrats' belief in capitalism make them fickle allies when it's time for real progress to be made. But despite her movement being put down, the German government and Italian government kept seeing increases with every election of leftist parties in their parliaments. As the conditions of capitalism got worse and worse, people saw that socialist answers of establishing more radical democratic power structures and the flattening of all, but especially economic hierarchies, was a very real and viable way out of this. Of course, though, this made established hierarchical power panic. In reaction to those workers' movements growing power and demanding a more equal democratic society, fascist movements courted capital to their side by promising a crackdown as long as capital would bend the knee in full subservience to their new state. Seeing no other way out, capital would side with and fund these fascist movements, willing to be subservient as long as their positions within the hierarchy were maintained. With the power of capital behind them, it was just a matter of time before they would break their way into the seats of power. This exact same dynamic also played out in Spain too, by the way. It just took longer, and they wouldn't have a domestic power grab, they'd have to fight a civil war. But with reactionary and capital forces working together, society had fallen. With fascistic movements now in the seats of power, capital had to become cozy with the state, or be branded traitorous allies to whomever the state declared degenerate. Mostly Jews and queers in the case of Germany, and mostly immigrants and ethnic minorities in the case of Italy. Although they all overlapped, and practically everyone that wasn't in the deemed-in group was persecuted nonetheless. So that's how fascism persuaded capital, but how did it persuade the masses? Well, they co-opted a lot of socialist talking points, but bastardized them to twist the targets of their ire, and then subsequently their message as a whole. The socialists correctly identified the capital-owning class as the problem, whereas fascists twisted that by identifying and targeting others. Where the socialists targeted capitalists, fascists targeted Jews or communists as the ones making your life harder. Since this of course wasn't the case, they'd have to fund massive propaganda campaigns and create wild conspiracies to brainwash the masses with. And with the full might of capital behind them, they had no shortage of resources to fund these messages with. And you can clearly tell this is their goal by just listening to how they describe it. Here Joseph Goebbels lays it out pretty clearly with just two of his quotes. Quote, "The bigger the lie, the more people will believe it." End quote. That's their deference to grand conspiracies that are so crazy and outlandish that to even believe it, they can't have had a worldview that followed reason or logic at all to begin with. Or they have to have been propagandized so hard that the new worldview that's been forced into them leaves no room for reason or logic. Then he says, quote, "The moment one becomes aware of propaganda, it loses its effectiveness." End quote. And this shows just how vital it is for them to keep people ideologically isolated, away from more coherent worldviews, because there's a chance that if they break outside of that bubble, to see it from the outside, the illusion will be shattered and the seeds of dissent planted. This is why ideological purity and a harsh ban of dissent is enforced by violent state power in fascistic societies.
We will make America great again.
So that was method 1, where fascism is a violent reaction to growing leftist movements. But what about method 2, where fascistic sentiment is allowed to grow under the nose of liberal capitalism, where their grievances for the concessions of the past have built up over really any period of time? This system of fascist buildup seems to be more modern. It's more the way of Hungary under Viktor Orban, or Russia under Putin, or America under Trump, where there isn't really a leftist movement to even be put down. Hungary or Russia doesn't have some massive socialist movement within them that's gaining more power year over year, whose party is overtaking their parliament. And in America, 2 Red Scares and a harsh neoliberal/neoconservative two-party establishment is firmly entrenched in its bourgeois democracy. No, it seems these systems of fascism are the result of a rising discontent with the failures of liberal capitalism, but the fascists have gained power and influence first, before any real leftist movements have even gotten the chance to build power. Or where the liberal establishment has put down leftist movements, but hasn't given the same treatment to fascist movements. So the system is putting its thumb on the scale to make sure leftist class consciousness hasn't built up, but leaves reactionary dismantling of the system unchecked. And of course, this whole time capital is being wooed over to the side of the reactionaries, as they promise even more power over society than even the liberal capitalists have given them. Again though, with the promise that they're subservient to the new order the reactionaries are trying to bring about. And you can see that pretty clearly with even just Trump's inauguration, that ceremony was a celebration from the capital-owning class of their victory over the liberal establishment. Musk was obviously there, but other billionaires like Bezos and Zuckerberg were there in celebration. Even Apple's Tim Cook, where he and his company try to appear more liberal-coded, have taken steps to align themselves with the Trump administration. Not all the forces of capital will jump to Team Fascist at the same pace, but you can be sure they'll get there eventually, or be put down as traitors to the movement. We're then left in a pretty dire situation, where the liberal establishment will allow fascism to fester, but cracks down on workers' movements. That leaves the liberals as the only oppositional force, at least within the establishment, to stand against the fascists. But they'll just stand aside and offer only symbolic opposition at best, and straight-up collaboration at worst. I mean, how the hell can we compete in an environment like that? I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it, the odds are looking very bad for America and the globe as a whole. Especially when you factor in that ticking time bomb of climate change is only going to make things even worse as time goes on. But despite the odds, we can't see the future. I mean, if you ask someone in the aftermath of the Black Death how society would fare in the future, they'd probably have a pretty doomerist, negative outlook. Little would they have known that soon after the plague, the European Dark Age would end and the Age of Enlightenment would begin. The scientific revolution soon followed. And yeah, it's not like the world was made good or ideal. There were still horrible things going on. But it wasn't the catastrophic end of days someone immediately following or even living through the European Dark Age of the Plague would have thought it was. And this isn't to be naive. I mean, things can still go bad. I mean, that's a very real possibility, but to act as if it's inevitable is to concede defeat before the battle even begins. And even if the worst did come to pass, there will always be a way out of it. And that requires doing the work now to plant those seeds of dissent, to spread proletarian ideology, to debunk the fascist lies. And remember that fascism is an inherently incompetent ideology. No fascist power can retain control for very long before collapsing under the weight of its own lies, or the fragile hold of power it has over hundreds of millions of people it has to keep in line. There will always be room for resistance, even in the worst case scenario. I mean, just look at Trump's administration right now. They haven't even succeeded in executing their full fascist takeover, and already their incompetence is leaving large cracks in their hold on power. The fact of the matter is, we don't know what the future holds. But our action and advocacy now will be the first steps on the road to the future we and the ones that will come after us have to live through. I think that radical and even borderline delusional optimism is necessary for the building of a better future. Pessimism guarantees defeat before we even have a chance, whereas optimism, even if wrong, leaves the door open for a better future.